Hi, you're with Julian on the Brown Note and a Gone But Forgotten, which is my occasional series on usually an album, sometimes a band, and infrequently a movie that was either denied classic status on release or has been forgotten about. So it came from the radio show where I'd feature an album where I thought, well, no one ever mentions this album anymore, and I already feel like I've made the wrong choice. Particularly as I've got about 8 new albums to review, which I've got one new review album coming up. I'm going to do Leftism by Leftfield, and I kind of feel like I should have chosen their second album, Rhythm and Stealth, because has Leftism really been that forgotten? I think in some ways it has, and I think a part of that is due to the fact that there was like from about 89 to 95, Britain went through one of the most fertile periods of electronic music in history, in global history. And it centered around two paradigm shifts led by the duo Orbital, which was moving the electronic dance record from the dance floor onto an album-length project, which they kind of pioneered. And it became the de facto receptacle for a lot of electronic music acts like the Chemical Brothers, the Prodigy, Underworld, and Leftfield, who all came through around the same time. And the other one was Orbital appearing on the main stage, the Pyramid stage at Glastonbury, on TV throughout the UK, which was like a landmark event, and moved these bands into the live arena, or where rock stages used to be an outside of a club. So that was a huge deal. And as I said, those acts, it kind of, I guess Britpop for dance music was kind of big beat. It sort of petered out into this sort of Fatboy Slim era a bit, which I'm not as fond of. But I think those the earlier wave of music by Orbital, Underworld, and the Chemical Brothers, the Prodigy, I think has stood up magnificently. You know, they're fantastic albums and their live concerts were amazing. I went to loads of them at the time. And Leftfield, I feel, maybe have been forgotten about a bit more because they stopped after Rhythm and Stealth in 1999, their second album, and didn't release another album for 16 years. So maybe that, because Orbital and Underworld and the Prodigy and all these acts continued on and released multiple projects and were festival staples for many years, maybe Leftism became like this holy Bible album, but maybe Rhythm and Stealth would have been the correct choice here. So Leftfield were very, very influential, a duel of Neil Barnes and Paul Daly, and they were so influential that their fusion of house music with dub and reggae was named Progressive House. They actually have the entire genre of progressive house pretty much created to describe their music. And I guess it's the biggest insult of all to describe Leftism as progressive house, because it is an overreaching view of electronic music in the UK at that time, which touches on a lot of different strands that were woven together. And probably, I guess Underworld and Orbital and those acts were leaning a little bit more towards techno than house, whereas the Leftism album does probably lean more towards house than the other acts that were around them at the time. And certainly the Prodigy and the Chemical Brothers weren't really, house artists at all. So Leftism actually is a collection of tracks that were released in the early 90s and put together as an album, but I feel it has held up incredibly well as an overview of British electronic music, and also as an album that 30 years, 10, 25 years later, 28 years later, has stood the test of time to be defined as a landmark classic that still sounds spectacular today. It came out in 1995 and was very acclaimed on release. But looking back on it recently, I'll just get the track list up because I've put some notes down as I was listening. I've given it another few plays. It's one of those albums that I've just always gone back to. And it's also one of those albums that on the it was a perfect CD length album. How long is it? 70 minutes, virtually on the dot, which says a lot. It was one of those albums that British people had it. If you went round for a dinner party, the CD case would have Portishead's Dummy, it would have Air Moon Safari, it would have Leftism, everyone. The first track, Release the Pressure, like I said, most of these tracks, well, I think one of the, like, you could have a collection of singles that would be ostensibly much more disjointed than this album pans out. It's sequenced so well. The duo didn't really like it when it came out. But I think the sequencing on the album has been one of the keys to its success. And the other thing is that being a collection of individual singles that built up over a few years has lent individual tracks to be very, very strong. So we get Release of Pressure straight off. It's a great entrance. And one of the things you notice straight away is how prominent vocals are on this album. And we get a very strong dub reggae vocal in a way that Horace Andy used to do for Massive Attack as well. And the other thing is the production of the duo is sparkling. It's just gorgeous productions throughout. And it's sort of... A nice trick they do is they build up sort of like a mid-tempo realm of a track, and at the halfway stage they plateau it, or they'll elevate it by introducing some synth pattern that makes everything much more exciting. And they do that with one of the longest tracks on the album, Release the Pressure, but also one of the most easy to listen to. The second track, Afro Left, another single, is a lot more pumping and slightly more difficult. It's a more aggressive track. It's got a non-English African vocal this time rather than a Caribbean English reggae vocal. It's got a really compelling string riff on it as well. I don't even know what the instrument is. And the temperature is a lot hotter on this track, particularly when, again, at the mid-stage, they just have this incredible pulsing strobe. It's a real out-of-the-gates start to the album, which is a little bit more club than their contemporaries would have been. I feel like often there was a stately grace to the opening and unfurling of albums by people like Orbital and Underworld, whereas this is really clubby. And I think those acts were much more clubby when they were live than they were on their records often. One thing that continually comes up in Leftism is the idea that you're in a science fiction movie and you're journeying through space. And I thought track 3, Melt, really had that interstellar voyage and travel element and reminded me of the krautrock legends Harmonia and their album Deluxe. It's the first instrumental, and it's a real come down after that sort of quite pulverizing opening 15 minutes of out and out dance music. And you kind of don't know where the album's going to go. Song of Life track 4 is a real, probably the grandest epic on the album. It sounds quite dull for a little while, but it goes through multiple stages where it picks up. It's got that Papua New Guinea future sound of London vibe, and then it drops these really big acid keys in, and then it hits a really hard 4-to-the-floor beat, going from a very sort of mid-tranquil opening into this really quiet, pulverizing track. It's a real epic and kind of reinvents the album and where it's going. And I think that if there's one point that launches this album away from being a collection of fantastic borderline house music, it's track 5, Original, using the lead singer of Curve, who were a shoegaze adjacent band in the early 90s, and she was probably alongside Mickey from Lush, because of her hair and her looks, a very prominent indie lead singer in that era. She was like a little bit Debbie Harry, maybe a dark-haired Debbie Harry, and she gives a vote. Original might actually be the greatest trip hop song of all time, or maybe that's Teardrop by Massive Attack. It probably is Teardrop by Massive Attack, but then this would probably be second. I would, if anyone's not heard the album Leftism, That's a good track to put on. Just go on YouTube and put on Leftfield Original. It's so gorgeous, the way it's got this sci-fi weave in, and then this dun-dun-dun-dun, incredibly halting bass line. It's so atmospheric, and Halliday's vocal is really well used. They use her in a lot of different vocal styles throughout the track. Film starts, film ends, nothing is said in between. I thought it was it's got a Jean-Michel Jarre vibe to these, very atmospheric synth lines in the background. Will it ever be the same again? Some really memorable lyrics. The closest the album comes to being Portishead's Dummy, really. An incredible track, and the third best track on the album. Well, it's tough. It's an album with virtually nothing that is, below a 7.5 out of 10 track-wise. It's and most tracks are probably 8.5 to 9.5 out of 10. But Original is, I think, it's kind of pushes the album into being something truly spectacular rather than just another really good album. Black Flute after that is very Orbital, short, and on an album where almost every track is over 6 minutes. It's only 3 minutes and 40, which is by miles the shortest. And it sort of picked up the tempo after the very stately and graceful Original. Back into Prog House for Space Shanty, another really big track. And again, the whole album has this really travelling through interstellar space vibe about it that continually gets referenced by the synths. And it's got a great electric riff in it, probably closer to the Chemical Brothers than anything else, and their sort of big room music than anything else on the album. And it's interesting, for an album that is called Prog House, and other acts were then called Prog House, for the final 5 tracks, there's really not anything that you would call house on here. They go back to the London sound clash sort of vibe with Inspection Check 1, which is a very sort of like the kind of music The Bug would make with London Zoo, though not as pulverisingly heavy, but very sort of Notting Hill Carnival sound clash sort of stuff. Really, really good. And the final 2 tracks proper, given that the final track, 21st Century Poem, is a real fade out with not much elements and a deliberate come down track, but we get 2 tracks in a row that are the best on the album, and it really does push it over into perfection for me. Storm 3000 is my favourite track on the album. It's an insane and beautiful and incredibly classy take on jungle and drum and bass, and it's got some of the most wicked breakbeats ever used, and these really heavy acid synth lines. It's so good. Like I said, my favourite on the album, one of my favourite tracks of all time. And it's got this incredible breakdown where it just sort of goes to a halt with this dripping acid synth before rearing up again. And that's followed by Open Up, which is the most famous song on the album. So the best 2 tracks on the album really are the last 13 minutes on the album. John Lydon's best vocal take outside of Public Image Limited or the Sex Pistols. It's an iconic track. It's still not really being bettered for what it does, or there isn't really anything completely like it. His vocal is so passionate, and it fits the style of music, which is, I guess, really thumping, banging techno, really. And it was one of the biggest hits from the album. I think in the modern era, the whole notion of the chorus of Burn Hollywood Burn would be very, very interesting for many, perhaps on the right. But yeah, the lyrics are quite enigmatic, really, because it's difficult to... He's very angry at something specific, and it's not exactly clear in what way or why. A lot is thrown up in the air here, but it's a terrific track. And then we get a sort of like Vangelis Blade Runner fade out with 21st Century Poem. So I think it stood the test of time. It's hugely influential. It's a beautiful representation of the incredible 5 years that British electronic music had at the start of the 90s. It stood the test of time, and the majority of tracks are above great, and it's sequenced beautifully. The production is just sparkling and gorgeous, and it is really varied, and overall, front back to listen, a perfect listening experience. So I'm going to give Leftism by Leftfield, a gone but forgotten 10 out of 10.